During the summer vacation after my second year of college, my friends and I decided to go on a trip. There were 3 of us, myself, Jenna, and Mark. Mark and I were roommates, but Jenna lived with some other people. After some discussion, we settled on Pensacola Beach in Florida. We lived in Atlanta, so that's close to a full day's drive for us. Mark and I found an Airbnb that seemed perfect. It was a quaint little house in a quiet neighborhood, and the price was within our budget for a 3-night stay. There were only 2 bedrooms, but the living room had a futon, so one of us would have to settle for that. We packed our bags and set off. The drive was long, but we had an alright time. I drove most of the way because we used my car, so when we got there, I was pretty tired. We arrived in the early evening. The sun was low in the sky. Mark had the directions open on his phone, and when we got close to the house, he pointed it out to us. When we pulled up, there was a man standing on the porch. Most hosts just leave the keys in a lockbox, but it seemed that this guy did things the old way. After parking the car, we walked up and introduced ourselves. The owner's name was Jack, and right from the start, something seemed off about him. He was a middle-aged man with a nervous energy. He greeted us with a forced smile and quickly ushered us inside. As he showed us around, he lingered, watching us closely, commenting on small irrelevant details. Jack insisted on showing us every single thing about the house. For example, he showed us how to adjust the temperature on the refrigerator. He walked us to the basement, showed us how to reset the water heater in case it stopped working. He even showed us the circuit box and how to fix it. I had never in my life needed to do any of those things, so what are the chances it would come up in a single weekend? His presence made us all uncomfortable, and he stayed for over an hour after we got there. I was really hungry, but I was trying to be polite, so I just went with it. Once Jack finally left, we unpacked and went out for some food. When we got back, we just sat around in the living room and talked. Jenna and Mark called dibs on both rooms first, so I was stuck sleeping in the living room. The house was cozy and well furnished. It was small, but comfortable enough for a few days. The next day passed without incident. We explored the town, enjoyed some local foods, and then returned to the house in the evening to relax and hang out. None of us was really into partying, so we mostly went out during the day and spent evenings relaxing. Mark got a little too much sun anyway, so he didn't want to do much. On the second evening, as we were sitting in the living room talking, the power suddenly went out. It was abrupt, and it startled me. We had the TV on in the background, but we were really just talking and hanging out. We scrambled for our phones to check if it was a blackout. However, when I looked out the window, I noticed that the street lights were still on, and the other houses in the neighborhood were lit up. Ours was the only place that was in darkness. We assumed it was a blown fuse or circuit. We then laughed, realizing that Jack's tour might have actually come in handy. We walked down to the basement and found the circuit box. As soon as I looked at it, I could tell that none of the switches were tripped. I was the only one paying attention to Jack's lesson, so the other 2 didn't know. Not knowing what else to do, we went back upstairs. We sat on the couch and talked about it. Mark wanted to call Jack, but Jenna didn't want to bother. It was already late, and we didn't want to sit through another one of his lectures. We decided to call him in the morning, and hopefully he would fix it while we were out of the house. We sat around talking for about another half hour, and when it was 11 p.m., there was a knock at the door. I went to answer, and to my surprise, it was Jack. He stood there with a smile on his face.
"Hey, just driving by, and I saw the power was out,"
he said. "Thanks, but we're just going to deal with it in the morning," I told him. Jenna, who was standing behind me, whispered, "This is really weird. How would he know the power was out unless he had something to do with it?" Jenna was right. It seemed too strange that he would show up at that exact moment, especially since we hadn't contacted him. He wouldn't have known just by driving by anyway. Just because the lights were out didn't mean the power was cut. I guess if he knew the house had a bad circuit, then maybe he was expecting it. But what was he doing? Just lingering outside the house waiting the whole time? It was strange, and we didn't want to let him in. He lingered for a few moments, making some small talk that felt forced and unnecessary. We all wanted him to leave, and after a few uncomfortable minutes, he finally did. After closing the door, we huddled together discussing the situation. We all agreed that it felt like Jack had cut the power deliberately, perhaps to create an excuse to come over. We debated what to do, whether to confront him, call the police, or just leave. In the end, we decided that Jack was weird but probably harmless. We stayed up for another hour and then went to bed. I folded out the futon in the living room, and the other two went to the bedrooms. In the morning when I got up, I walked around the place and went to the kitchen. That's when I noticed that the power was back on. The clock on the oven was blinking 12 o'clock, like it needed to be reset. Jenna and Mark got up soon after. We were kind of relieved that we wouldn't have to deal with it anymore. However, when I saw Jenna, it seemed like she had seen a ghost. She was holding a piece of paper in her right hand. She passed it to me. It read,
Just came to fix the power. Jack.
Jenna then told me that she found it on the table right next to her bed, and she was sure it was not there the night before. Needless to say, we were all really creeped out, especially Jenna. What on earth would make him think it was okay to do that? Fixing the power was one thing, but going into Jenna's room when she was sleeping was completely unacceptable. I still don't know if he was actually dangerous, maybe just extremely socially unaware, or maybe he was an actual psycho. We couldn't risk it either way. The last night of our trip was spent in a hotel. It wasn't what we planned, but we were just relieved to be out of that house. We reported the incident to Airbnb, explaining our concerns about Jack and the strange power outage. They were apologetic and offered us a refund, which we appreciated. I run an Airbnb, and I have some crazy stories. My parents had bought this 2-story house as an investment, and I was living on the main floor. The upstairs had been converted into a 2-bedroom apartment, which I managed. It was a good arrangement. I could keep an eye on the property from my parents, and they let me live downstairs for very low rent. Sometimes I would even get it for free, depending on how many guests came in, but that was rare. The place was laid out with a single entrance that both I and the guests used. There was a shared hallway, which is where the laundry was. Then there was a heavy door to my place, and a staircase leading up to the rental unit upstairs. That had its own locking door as well. The upstairs rental had been doing well. We usually had a steady stream of guests, most of them tourists. I lived in a quiet mountain town, and the place was packed in the winter for the skiing season. In the summer, it's a good spot too, but it quiets down a bit. I met all kinds of interesting folks, and for the most part, it was a positive experience. A few things happened over the last few years, though, that I would rather not repeat. I've seen pretty much everything. People have trashed the place a handful of times. There's been noise so bad that the neighbors called the police. Someone even threw a chair through the window once. Luckily, Airbnb is pretty good for reimbursing us for that kind of stuff. Even after being through all of that, one night still stands out to me. It was a Friday evening, and I had just finished cleaning up after dinner. I heard some noise upstairs, which wasn't unusual since I had a guest staying. He was a solo traveler and seemed friendly when he checked in. I didn't think much of it and settled down in the living room to watch some TV. It was unusual to see a single person because our place was big enough for at least 3, 2 bedrooms and a pull-out couch in the living room. There were motels in town that would have been cheaper, so we usually got groups of at least 2. It was the summer season though, so our prices were a little less than in the winter. It was still around $150 per night though. As time went on, the noise upstairs grew louder. I could hear music and the sound of someone talking, albeit slurred. Since he was alone, I wasn't sure who he was talking to. Maybe he knew someone in town, or maybe he was on the phone. It sounded like the guest had been drinking, probably a bit too much. I considered going up to ask him to keep it down, but I decided against it. I didn't want to be the overbearing host, and I figured he'd eventually quiet down. But then at around midnight, things took a turn for the worse. I was in bed, still awake, when I heard heavy stomping footsteps coming down the stairs from the Airbnb. Then I heard loud banging on my door. I sat up in bed and listened. The banging continued, and I got up to check it out. I knew it was my guest, and I was hoping I could talk him into going to bed. "Who is it?" I called out. He was slurring his words, barely coherent, but I could make out enough. He was demanding to be let in. Confused and alarmed, I told him this was my private residence, and he needed to go back upstairs, but he wouldn't listen. He continued yelling and banging on the door harder. His words were jumbled and incoherent. I obviously didn't open the door, but I couldn't just go to bed either. I didn't know what he was capable of in that state. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police. I'd had to call them a few times before, so I let them know that it was an unruly guest and I asked them to send someone over. They told me officers were on their way and to stay on the line. The banging continued, and this time I looked through the peephole. I saw the guy standing there. His eyes were bloodshot and he wasn't wearing a shirt. But the worst part was that tucked into his pants, I could see a handgun. Guns are common where I live, so I'm not usually that scared of them, but in this situation, it was downright terrifying. I backed away from the door, not sure what he would do if he broke through. I was alone, and the thought of facing an angry, armed, drunk man was not something I was prepared for. I ran over to my bedroom and closed the door. It didn't even have a lock. About 5 minutes later, the police got there and took the guy away. After a while, one of the officers came down. He explained that the guest was extremely intoxicated and that he was taken to the station for the night. The next day, the police called me and I found out some more disturbing details. It turned out that the guy had a criminal record and he was not allowed to possess a firearm. His gun was unregistered and probably bought on the black market. He had done time for armed robbery as well as breaking into houses. That seemed to make sense. I guess that night was just an old habit for him. So I almost got robbed by one of my guests. It was the worst thing that happened to me so far. When I went up to the apartment to check the damage, it was surprisingly not that bad. There were some empty liquor bottles and some spilled drinks, but I had seen much worse. The mess wasn't a problem. I didn't appreciate the attempted break-in, though. I used to live in a condo downtown in a large city. I didn't own the place. I was renting it, thankfully. My building was occupied mostly by Airbnb rentals, which meant a constant flow of different people coming and going. Weekends were particularly noisy. The halls and common areas were packed with people on vacation from other places. Therefore, there was a lot more partying in that building than anywhere else I had ever lived. I was working a 9-to-5 job at the time, so I was usually in bed by 11 or midnight at the latest. It was not uncommon for me to be woken up or kept up by screaming or other noise. I learned to live with it. It wasn't ideal, but moving is a hassle, and I got a pretty good deal on my place. This happened several years ago. It was a Wednesday night in the summer. I had a busy day at work. I worked in an office near my condo, and by the time I got back in the evening, I was looking forward to a quiet night in. I made myself some dinner, watched a bit of TV, and then settled down on the couch with a book. It was around 11 p.m. when the noise started. At first, it was just raised voices in the hallway. That wasn't unusual, so I tried to ignore it and focus on my book. But the voices grew louder. There must have been at least 4 people shouting at each other. It sounded like a fight was breaking out. It was hard to ignore, and that's where my attention was. Then I heard a banging sound. Could have been somebody shoved against the wall. Things escalated from there. Fights had broken out in the building before, but they usually fizzled out quickly. Our building security could usually handle most issues like that. I never had to call them. The place was wired up with cameras, so they were usually on top of it whenever something would happen. This time, however, the argument escalated so rapidly that I guess the security guys didn't have time to break it up. There were thuds and crashes, like somebody was getting thrown around. I thought about calling security myself, but before I could decide, a loud sound pierced through the noise. It had to be a gunshot. The sound echoed in the hallway, and a chilling silence followed. My hands trembled, and my mind raced with panic. I had never been so close to real violence, let alone a shooting. For a few moments, I was frozen, not sure what to do. I felt that sound deep in my chest. I had no idea how loud a shot could be. I actually checked my body to make sure that I wasn't hit. That's how close it felt. Then I heard someone running down the hallway. Their footsteps were scraping against the cheap carpet that lined the floor. That was followed by the sound of a door slamming. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. The operator answered, and I quickly explained what happened. They told me to stay in my apartment, lock the door, and wait for the police to arrive. My door was already locked, so I just went to my bedroom and stood there, pacing occasionally. Within minutes, I heard sirens approaching. There were sirens blaring around there most of the time anyway, but I was pretty sure these ones were for us. I heard the cops outside in the hallway, talking and moving around. They knocked on every door on my floor, and eventually made it to mine. I let them in, and they asked me some questions. I told them everything I heard, the arguing, the loud bang that sounded like a gunshot, and the sound of somebody running away. I didn't know which door the person went into, but it was one of the ones near mine. The officers wrote down what I said and told me to stay inside my apartment. They said they had to check the rest of the building. I locked my door, and after they left, I went to my living room. I was still pretty shaken up. I tried to distract myself by watching TV, but really couldn't focus on anything. I kept thinking about the gunshot and how close it was to my apartment. It was scary to think that something like that could happen right next to where I lived. The rest of that night was pretty tense. I stayed up late listening to the sounds in the building. I heard the police talking to other people and walking around. After a while, things began to quiet down, but I still felt uneasy. In the morning, I found out more about what happened. Someone was indeed shot. I learned that the victim of the shooting survived and was recovering. The person responsible was eventually caught and arrested. It turned out to be a dispute between two Airbnb guests that tragically escalated. In the following days, the police returned a few times, asking more questions, trying to piece together the events of the night. The shooting changed the atmosphere in the building. Once news hit of what happened, the rental scene in the building died down. Nobody wanted to stay there anymore. The building management tightened security, but that wasn't enough for me. I moved out the next month. I had to break my lease. I figured the rentals would pick up again once the news cycle passed. That building was not a good place to live. I just couldn't stay there anymore. There's been talk in my city of banning Airbnb outright. I think the main concern is housing prices. I don't believe that problems like this are that widespread. Either way, it would be good for those who are trying to live in buildings like mine if they are banned. A lot of people buy those places to make rental income from Airbnb though, so it would be tough for them. Whatever happens, I won't be there to see it. I hope I never set foot in that building again. My name's Dennis, and this happened to me 5 years ago. My best friend is Jesse, and we've known each other since we were really young. We were in our late 20s when this took place. Jesse and I were both city guys, and neither of us had any real experience with the outdoors. We both wanted to change that though, so for vacation one year, we rented a cabin on Airbnb. It wasn't that rugged or anything. The place had power, indoor plumbing, and even Wi-Fi. Not the best Wi-Fi, but still. It was, however, quite isolated from any neighbors. The nearest neighbor was at least a few miles. We had both taken a week off work, but we only had the cabin for 4 nights. The drive there was long, about 5 hours from our city. When the cabin finally came into view, it was just as good as we had hoped. It was not exactly what you would expect from a cabin. The outside had vinyl siding, not wooden logs like you would think. We didn't care though. It was the location that really mattered, and this place was perfect. There was a great view from the porch, and the living room window overlooked a small lake off in the distance. I parked my car, and we both got out. Our host had given us a key code for the door, so I pulled it out on my phone and made my way up the path. When we got to the front door, I noticed something. The electronic lock on the cabin's front door was kind of broken. It still worked, but it was really loose on the door. I put in the code, and it opened, but I'm pretty sure that I could have just jiggled it out of place if I wanted to. It didn't seem very secure, but when you got in, there was another lock on the inside. We figured that was fine, so we put it aside and settled in. The interior was basic. There was a single bedroom as well as a loft up top. Jesse took the bedroom, and I took the loft, because Jesse's afraid of heights. We settled in for the night, and got up early in the morning. We headed out on one of the trails. It was pretty short, and we finished it by noon. After lunch, Jesse looked up another trail that was a short drive away, so we got into the car and went there. It was a larger, more established route, and it took us the better part of a day. By the time we were finished, it was almost dark. On the way back, we stopped off at a restaurant to have dinner, since we were both too hungry to make something back at the cabin. When we got back, it was around 10 p.m. and it was completely dark. On the road in, I thought I saw a person dart across in front of the car. It was a good 100 feet ahead, and I wasn't sure if it was an animal or a person. We were pretty close to the cabin though, so if it were a person, then they were definitely trespassing. I didn't even bother mentioning it to Jesse, because I wasn't sure if it was nothing. When we got back inside, Jesse and I talked for a while, then we went to bed. I climbed up the tall ladder to the loft, and Jesse went into the single bedroom. When I was about to fall asleep, Jesse called out to me. I asked him what happened, and he told me to come down. I climbed down the ladder and walked into the room. He had found something in the closet, a backpack that definitely wasn't ours. It was a medium-sized hiking bag, and it looked dirty. There was a small tear in the side, but we didn't open it, and neither of us even touched it. It was weird, to say the least. The cabin was supposed to be cleaned and emptied between guests, so finding someone else's belongings was unusual. We speculated about it for a while. Maybe the previous guests had forgotten it, or perhaps the cleaners missed it. In the end, we decided to just leave it. It was none of our business anyway. I climbed up the ladder to my bed, and Dennis shut the door to his room. I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember is being jolted awake by a scream from Jesse's room. I leapt out of bed and slid down the ladder, then rushed to his room, not sure what to expect. I barged in through the door and turned on the light. Jesse was standing next to his bed, and I saw a man jumping out the window. I didn't get a good look at him, and all I saw was his back and maybe one of his legs. He was almost out by the time I got there. Jesse was just standing there shaking, his face pale with shock. He told me he had woken up to the man standing over him in his bed, and that he was looking through his things. When Jesse screamed, the man bolted. He fumbled with the lock on the window for a second, then he got it open and jumped out. We were both shaken up pretty bad. It was about 10 or 15 minutes before we were able to think straight. By then, some of the clues started to make sense. We figured that the man was staying at the cabin without anyone knowing. Then Jesse walked over to the closet and opened the door. The strange backpack was gone. We were pretty sure it belonged to the guy who had broken in. Either that, or the guy stole it. Like I said before though, it was dirty and there was a rip in the side, so we thought it must have been his. We stayed up for the rest of the night, lights on, talking about what to do. We checked all the windows and doors to make sure they were secure, but we still felt scared. It was 2:30 by then, but neither of us was even a little bit tired. As soon as the sun rose, we packed our things. We had planned to stay longer, but neither of us wanted to spend another minute in that place. We locked the door as best we could and drove away. On the way back, Jesse called the host. We explained everything: the broken lock, the backpack, and the man in the night. The host seemed very shocked. They promised to head over and fix the lock immediately. They also gave us a full refund for the entire stay. I would have been happy enough with a refund just for the nights we didn't use. Because of that, I didn't give them a bad review. Since he seemed to be taking it seriously, I thought he deserved a chance to get it taken care of. We think the man we saw secretly lived in that cabin when it wasn't being used. Then when we stayed there, he must have decided to rob us. I didn't see the man well, but Jesse got a better look at him, and he didn't see a gun, a knife, or any kind of weapon. That doesn't mean the man wasn't dangerous though. We just don't know for sure. I checked Airbnb every once in a while to see if this place was still there. For at least a few years afterwards, it was still up and running. It had good reviews too, many of which were from after our stay, so I think the guy must have been caught, or maybe he just moved on. Or possibly, the host just ramped up security enough that he got scared away. That's good, I guess, but I won't be taking another chance with that place. I'd be too scared. Last summer, my sister and I decided to spend a weekend at a rented cottage. It was an area that we used to go to every summer as kids. As adults, we've been wanting to go back there for the sake of nostalgia. A family friend of ours used to own a place nearby, but they had to sell it years ago. The place we rented on Airbnb looked almost like a townhouse in the woods. There were 2 other units attached to it, and I think they were both available for rent as well, but we only saw the one when we were on Airbnb. It was a cozy little place surrounded by trees, and there were not any other cottages for a mile or 2 in either direction. Apart from our immediate neighbors, there really wasn't anybody else around. We arrived on a Friday afternoon. The way in was a long dirt road that was barely wide enough for a single car. When we were driving in, we saw a man walking down the side of the road. He was middle-aged and wore a blue baseball hat. He had long hair sticking out from the hat, and he wore a red flannel shirt. We thought he would be one of our neighbors, but when we got to the cottage and met the other people, we found out that he wasn't. The cottages were charming, with a small porch in the front and one in the back. There was a fireplace on the inside, with a small couch and 2 chairs in front of it. We spent the evening cooking dinner, playing board games, and just enjoying each other's company. The first hint that our peaceful weekend might be disrupted came on the first night. We were sitting in the living room talking around the fireplace when there was a knock on the door. We weren't expecting anyone, so it was a surprise. I went to see who it was anyway. My sister followed close behind. Standing on the porch was the man we saw on the side of the road on our way in. I opened the door a crack, leaving the chain lock on. He quickly explained that he was looking for his lost dog, and asked if we had seen him. We told him we hadn't seen any dogs and offered to keep an eye out. He grumbled something, and then disappeared into the growing darkness of the evening. As an animal lover, I could relate, but I did think it was weird. We had seen him hours earlier in the day, without a dog. If my dog was missing for hours, then I would have been knocking on doors much sooner. The man also didn't seem very worried. I didn't know for sure if he was faking, but to me, it didn't add up. The next day, we saw him again. He was walking past the front of our cottage, still with no dog. He didn't come to the door, and he didn't see us looking at him through the window. His presence was unsettling, but we tried to brush off our concerns, thinking maybe he was just desperate to find his dog. That night, however, something else happened. There was another knock on our door, much like the previous night. It was late, much later than before. I peered through the window and saw that it was the same man. I didn't open the door this time. I just said, "Can I help you?" This time he claimed his car was broken down and claimed he needed our phone to call for help. His appearance was more disheveled than the day before, and there was a certain intensity in his eyes that made us both nervous. I told him through the closed door that I would call for help, but when I went to get my phone, I found out that there was no service. Service was sparse at best since we had been there, but at that moment, it was completely gone. I told him that my phone wasn't working, and suggested that he check with one of the other neighbors. Then I closed the curtains and sat on the couch with my sister. We whispered to each other about the guy while we sat there. We could see through the curtains that the man was still on the porch. He started pacing around, occasionally stopping to knock on the door or window. He was asking us to open up. Not in an aggressive way, but more in a playful but really creepy way. It reminded me of some kind of clown from a horror movie. It's like he was toying with us. My sister and I stayed up for the entire night, keeping watch. We moved furniture in front of the door, we talked in whispers, and we jumped at every sound. The man stayed on our porch for hours, pacing back and forth. Eventually, he sat down on the steps, as if he were waiting for us to change our mind. We watched it all through a crack in the curtains. By the time the first light of dawn came, we were exhausted and determined to leave. We packed our things quietly and moved swiftly. The man was still outside, now asleep on the porch. We managed to slip past him, get into our car, and drive away without waking him up. As we left the cottage behind, the relief was palpable. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town. There we called the police and reported what happened. We also called our Airbnb host. Shockingly, he seemed rather unsurprised. We found out this was not the first time it happened. The host seemed to think the man was harmless, but when we told him that the guy literally slept on the porch, he was shocked. I hope he did something about it.